Leonora was King Ober's eldest daughter, and from an early age, she knew that one day she would have to take the kingdom from his hands. While other children learned dancing and horseback riding for pleasure, she sat in on council meetings, read reports, studied old treaties, and could name every fortress along the northern border without a map. She had a quick mind, noticed small details, and rarely allowed herself to speak before she was certain of her answer. Ober trusted her judgment. After she gave him good advice, he would nod briefly, and sometimes say that without Leonora, the court would long ago have become tangled in its own affairs. She remembered those words better than their rare affectionate conversations, and tried to give her father fewer and fewer reasons to doubt her. In the mornings, papers and seals awaited her, while in the far wing of the palace, the day began quite differently. In that distant wing, Avelina was more often found in the conservatory, the library, or the small infirmary near the servants' quarters than in the council chambers. During her mother's long illness, she had assisted the elderly court physician, handing him clean linen, grinding herbs in a mortar, preparing infusions, and staying at the Queen's bedside through the night. After the Queen's death, the physician continued her lessons. Avelina learned to recognize medicinal plants by their leaves and scent, detect fever in a person's breathing, clean wounds, and bandage them without unnecessary fuss. The infirmary smelled of mint and sage. The pages of an old herbal rustled softly, and glass vessels chimed with every movement. She knew that a patient needed not only reassurance, but proper treatment. At court, people noticed this more and more often, involuntarily comparing the abilities of the two sisters. As children, Leonora and Avelina had often been together. But as the years passed, their days crossed less and less. Advisors, ambassadors, and reports awaited the elder sister. Books, patients, and the quiet rooms of the infirmary awaited the younger. The palace grew accustomed to it. People went to Leonora when a decision was needed, and to Avelina when they wanted to speak of fear or misfortune. Leonora noticed how people bowed their heads respectfully after she spoke, while beside her sister they allowed themselves to smile, breathe more freely, and speak of personal matters. It troubled her more deeply than she was willing to admit. She wished Avelina no harm. Something else frightened her more. The thought that one day she might no longer be needed. Avelina mistook her reserve for weariness, and their father unwittingly helped that mistake take root. After his wife's death, Ober summoned Leonora to his study before the council more and more often, entrusted her with reviewing reports, and asked her opinion about ambassadors and treaties. He trusted her as an equal in affairs of state, but at family dinners he often continued speaking to her about those same duties. With Avelina, the king was gentler. He took an interest in her books and smiled at her stories about the infirmary. but he rarely asked what she thought about the affairs of the kingdom. Her knowledge seemed important to him, but it belonged, in his mind, to another private side of life. Oba did not notice how this distinction was driving the sisters apart. Then word came to the palace. The young Emperor Lucian was coming to conclude an alliance that the court already expected to be sealed by his marriage to Leonora. Lucian was young, but he had ruled a vast empire on his own for several years and knew the cost of decisions upon which peace at the border depended. Both countries needed an alliance with Oba, but he did not want to settle the matter of his future marriage on the strength of a portrait, courtiers' letters, and lines in a treaty. At formal meetings, Lucian had too often noticed how those he spoke with watched his title and chose their answers carefully. And so, several days before the embassy arrived, he came to the palace as an imperial advisor, supposedly sent ahead to prepare the negotiations. Only 2 companions knew his true identity. His plain travelling cloak was dusty. His face bore the weariness of the road, and his attentive gaze caught small details, though even he did not always understand them correctly. Leonora knew that he was an influential advisor to the emperor, and so every word seemed to her a part of the coming negotiations. She spoke of trade routes, borderlands, the terms of peace, and what the alliance would bring to both countries. Lucian listened with sincere interest. Her knowledge was precise, her reasoning clear, and her sense of responsibility beyond doubt. But he noticed how carefully she chose her words, how she paused before answering, and how she asked almost no questions about him personally. All Lucian lacked was the simple ease that could exist between 2 people. Leonora tried to show him what a reliable ruler she would become, and when the conversation ended, decided that she had not made a single mistake. At that moment, the sound of a goblet shattering rang out nearby. The crash of the fallen goblet made several guests turn around. A young page hurried to gather the shards and cut his palm. The steward was about to lead him away, so as not to disrupt the evening, but Avelina noticed the wound and calmly took the young man into the adjoining room. She washed his palm, carefully removed a small, shallow splinter, and bandaged his hand with clean linen. Then, supporting his wrist in her palm as she was accustomed to doing, she asked the page to bend his fingers slowly, making sure the bandage did not restrict his movement. From the open doorway, Lucian watched her precise, confident actions. Avelina did not glance back at the guests or wait to be thanked. When she had finished, she returned to the hall as though she had merely done what was required, while Lucian continued to follow her with his eyes for some time. After the evening ended, Lucian went out into the conservatory. The air between the tubs of lemon trees smelled of damp earth, coolness rose from the stone slabs, and the fountain had already fallen silent. Near the far door, he met Avelina. "You helped the page well," he said. "He simply needed a bandage," she replied, and looking more closely at his tired face, added, "And how long has it been since you spent an entire day without a retinue or state papers?" Lucian smiled a little wearily. "At court, that is rare. The moment you stop, someone is already waiting for a decision or a confident answer." Avelina nodded. A physician does not always have answers at once either. Sometimes everything necessary has been done, but the person is still afraid. Then I simply stay beside them. Lucian asked about the infirmary, the herbs, and the kinds of cases entrusted to her. At first, Avelina answered briefly, then realized that he was truly listening and was in no hurry to change the subject. They remained beside the silent fountain a little longer. When it was time to part, they said goodbye without unnecessary words, carrying with them a calm and still unfamiliar sense of ease. The next morning, the imperial embassy entered the palace, and before the assembled court, yesterday's advisor appeared in Lucian's imperial robes. At first, Avelina could not believe her eyes. So it was the emperor himself who had spoken to her in the conservatory. "Forgive me for the deception," Lucian said. "I wanted to see your family before portraits and diplomatic letters decided everything for me." He thanked Leonora for their conversation the day before, and calmly added that her knowledge and good judgment were worthy of a future ruler. Then he turned to Oba and asked for Avelina's hand, explaining that a personal trust rare in his life had arisen between them. Avelina was bewildered. "I placed my trust in the man I met yesterday," she said at last, "and now I am willing to come to know him under his true name." A quiet murmur passed through the hall. Leonora did not say a word. Only her fingers locked together too tightly. Suddenly, she felt as though all her years of effort had proven only one thing. Being needed did not mean being loved. When the courtiers had left, Leonora remained beside the table and was silent for a while. "Father, why was I allowed for so many years to believe that it was my marriage to Lucian that would seal the alliance?" Oba looked away. Leonora began to speak more quickly. Would her right of succession remain intact? Would the emperor influence the king's decisions through Avelina? What would become of the agreements drafted for a marriage to the heir? "I ask only for a delay," she said. "Let Avelina leave the palace for a short while, until we understand the consequences." Oba hesitated. He was afraid of losing Leonora's trust, and he himself did not want to give Lucian too much influence. Then she proposed that they tell the emperor Avelina had grown frightened and refused the marriage. It would give them time, Leonora insisted, though something personal could already be heard in her persistence. Oba understood that this was deception, but instead of summoning both daughters, he removed the royal seal from his belt and silently handed it to Leonora for the order sending Avelina away. A few days later, a hunt was arranged for Lucian. Avelina was supposed to meet him before dawn at the old stone bridge, but royal servants came to her chambers. They showed her an order bearing Ober's seal. The king had supposedly fallen ill and urgently awaited his daughter at a country house. Avelina asked them to tell Lucian that she would be delayed and stepped into a closed carriage. At first, fields and villages passed beyond the windows. Then the wheels began to rumble over stones. The road bells faded away, and her escorts stopped answering her questions. The carriage stopped among barren hills beside a solitary tower. Guards stood at the entrance. A room had been prepared upstairs, and the captain of the guard held the same order bearing her father's seal. Avelina understood that this was no mistake made by strangers. When the door closed behind her and the key turned softly in the lock, she thought only of Lucian, who would be waiting at the bridge without knowing why she had not come. Lucian waited at the old stone bridge until the hunters began preparing to depart. Avelina was not among them. He looked for her among the members of the hunting party and questioned servants and guests, but no one could explain her disappearance. That evening, Ober, trying to speak calmly, gave him a sealed note. Lucian recognized the handwriting at once. Avelina wrote that she had become frightened of life at the imperial court, changed her mind, and asked him not to look for her again. Lucian read the letter twice. He allowed that he might have misunderstood their recent conversation. Yet her sudden departure and silence seemed strange. He accused Ober of nothing. Before going to bed, Lucian summoned his loyal groom, Martin, and ordered him to question the stable hands, check the gates, and examine the wheel tracks. When darkness fell, Martin went out through the servants' gate and began tracing the route of the vanished carriage. Beyond Avelina's door began the silence of the desolate tower. It stood amid dry, stony hills and thorny thickets, far from villages and roads. The upper room held a bed, a table, a hearth, and a narrow window with a stone sill. Food, water, and clean linen were brought by Mistress Marta, Leonora's former governess. She spoke calmly to Avelina, was never rude, and made sure she had everything she needed. "At least deliver a letter to my father," Avelina asked one day. Marta lingered at the door, averted her gaze, and folded her hands with too much care. "I cannot, without the princess's permission. The order was given for the peace of the kingdom." Every evening, Marta recorded Avelina's questions, her activities, and any attempt to contact the outside world. She folded the first such report, sealed it, and prepared it to be sent to Leonora. During the first days, Avelina tried to keep her hands occupied with simple work. She dusted the room, mended an old coverlet, and moved the bed closer to the hearth, where warmth lingered in the evenings. During a short walk in the enclosed courtyard, she noticed lemon balm and sage, and transplanted several sturdy plants into clay cups. When she rubbed a leaf between her fingers, the air filled with a familiar scent. In the evenings, Avelina wrote down dates, martyrs' words, and everything that had happened that day in a small notebook, so that nothing would blur together in her memory. One day she heard the scratch of tiny claws at the window. A small tame monkey made its way along the outer ledge to the sill. Avelina offered it a piece of dried apple. The monkey took the treat and remained for a few moments longer. Martin began with the stables and the servants' gates. He questioned the coachman, compared the horses' colouring and harnesses, remembered who had seen the closed carriage, and followed its wheel tracks to a seldom used road leading into the hills. After taking wrong turns and retracing his path, several days later, he finally found the desolate tower. Hidden among the thorny bushes, Martin watched the guards and the upper window. When Avelina appeared there, he held up Lucian's letter and showed her the imperial seal. Avelina unravelled the edge of her silk sash, twisted the threads into a long cord, and lowered it. Martin attached the letter. After reading it, she hurriedly wrote in her own hand that she had not rejected Lucian and was being held there against her will. Her reply went down by the same route. Martin hid the note and made his way back to Lucian. At agreed hours, Martin returned to the tower, and letters travelled up and down on the silk cord. At first, Lucian proposed openly demanding Avelina's release, and, if Oba refused, bringing his men to the tower. Avelina asked him not to rush. The guards, the inhabitants of nearby villages, and the emperor's companions should not suffer because of a royal family's decision. She suggested preserving the letters, retracing the carriage's route, finding witnesses to the order, and inviting neutral ambassadors before whom the king would have to answer openly. Lucian considered her words and agreed. Using force could turn a family's deception into a conflict between two nations. In the letters that followed, they spoke more openly. Lucian confessed, "I almost believed that note." Avelina replied that she feared not only the tower, but the truth about Leonora. It pained her to think that she might lose forever the sister with whom she had grown up. Before long, they agreed that Lucian would begin gathering witnesses and appealing to ambassadors, while Avelina would continue recording everything that happened in the tower. Lucian formally demanded that Oba reveal where Avelina was and allow neutral witnesses to see her. The king answered evasively. According to him, his daughter had left willingly and did not wish to return to court. Lucian's advisors suggested moving warriors toward the border or sending a detachment to the tower, considering it a lawful way to protect his imprisoned bride. The emperor refused. He had promised Avelina not to endanger the guards or the people of the surrounding lands. Instead, Lucian invited representatives of a neutral kingdom, but they would take several days to arrive. He could not travel openly to the tower. The family might become suspicious of the secret route by which the letters were being carried. The tower may be under watch, Martin warned. After dark, they nevertheless prepared 2 horses without imperial insignia. At night, Lucian and Martin reached the desolate tower. Martin remained at the edge of the thicket, where he could see the road, while Lucian approached the wall alone and quietly tapped the stone twice with a broken branch. Avelina appeared in the narrow window. "I have demanded your release," he said, "and invited neutral ambassadors. They will be here in a few days." "Thank you for not bringing soldiers," she replied. After a brief pause, she added, "But do not come here alone again. I do not know who is watching the tower, or what Marta writes in her reports." They arranged to meet in 3 nights, when the ambassadors would already be nearby. "Until then, I will do nothing rash," Lucian promised. Avelina placed her palm on the stone sill. Lucian raised his hand towards the window, though the wall, the height, and the night air still lay between them. He left as quietly as he had come, and in the dark corridor, Marta, standing with an extinguished candle, already knew that in 3 days independent witnesses would arrive at the tower. At dawn, Marta sent Leonora a report of the nighttime visit. The emperor knew where Avelina was being held, was preparing neutral witnesses, and intended to return in 3 nights. Leonora read the report twice. In 3 days, her father would no longer be able to deny the imprisonment. She thought of Oba's trust and the throne, and forced herself to reason through the matter in order. Lucian must not die. The emperor's death would mean war. She needed something else, for him to believe in Avelina's betrayal and withdraw of his own accord. Leonora remembered an old border mechanism, a falling net fitted with thin needles. They were coated with a sleeping resin. An ordinary dose induced sleep, while many punctures could cause a severe fever. She knew the risk, but called it acceptable for the sake of preserving her power. By noon, the order had been given to deliver the net and the resin to the desolate tower. At Leonora's command, trusted armourers brought the old border mechanism to the tower and concealed it in the thorny thicket beneath the window. The thin needles were coated with sleeping resin, though no one could know exactly how many of them would pierce a person. Marta provided samples of Avelina's handwriting and an impression of her old personal seal. A man skilled at imitating another person's hand wrote a letter on paper from Leonora's private chancery, bearing her customary watermark, and the sealing wax was stamped with a reproduction of Avelina's mark. In the note, Avelina supposedly asked Lucian not to wait until the 3rd night, but to come the very next night, alone. A disguised servant delivered the letter without explanation. The sudden change made Lucian wary, but the familiar handwriting, seal, and details of their conversation led him to think that Avelina might be in some new danger. "It could be a trap," Martin said. Lucian allowed him to follow, but ordered him to remain far behind. Lucian was to approach the tower alone. On the night named in the forged letter, Lucian came to the tower earlier than they had truly agreed. Martin remained at a distance, as they had decided, at the edge of the dark thicket, but kept both the tower and the road leading to it in sight. Avelina knew nothing of the visit. In her room, the little monkey stole Marta's spectacles, perched on the windowsill, and began trying them on. It turned the frames upside down, put them on again, and finally stared through the lenses while holding them with both paws. After long, anxious days, Avelina laughed despite herself. Lucian was already approaching the thicket beneath the window when he heard that brief laugh. It seemed to him that Avelina truly was waiting for him and was glad he had come. Encouraged, he dismounted and moved carefully between the thorny branches. Something gave almost imperceptibly beneath his boot. Very close by, a quiet click sounded in the stillness of the night. The click had barely faded when the net dropped from above. It knocked Lucian off his feet, and several thin needles pierced his cloak and clothing. As he fell, he heard the last of Avelina's laughter above him, and now it sounded entirely different. For one brief moment, he imagined that she had known what was about to happen beneath her window. Martin saw movement in the thicket and rushed forward. He cut the fastenings, helped Lucian free himself, and picked up the letter that had fallen from his clothing. Lanterns carried by approaching guards had already appeared on the road. They reached the horses they had left behind and hastened toward the border. To Lucian, everything seemed to fit together. The changed night, the request that he come alone, the trap under the window, and the laughter. But in her earlier letters, she asked you not to take risks, Martin reminded him. Lucian tried to answer, but the resin was already taking effect. The punctures burned, his thoughts became confused, and a fever was beginning. At the first safe refuge, he asked Martin never to speak Avelina's name again. Later, sinking into a heavy half-sleep, he called for her several times himself. On the appointed night, Avelina waited a long time for the agreed signal, but neither Lucian nor Martin appeared. In the days that followed, she looked out the window more and more often, and finally noticed broken branches below the tower and a scrap of expensive fabric that resembled Lucian's cloak. It was enough for her to understand that something terrible had happened near the tower. When Marta brought food, and as usual left the ring of keys outside, Avelina made her decision. She stepped into the corridor, closed the door, and locked Marta inside her room, where water, food, and the hearth remained. In Marta's small office, Avelina found copies of her reports to Leonora, exercises imitating Avelina's handwriting, and the forged seal. Taking the papers, the notebook, and travelling necessities, she left the key beside the threshold where Marta could reach it. In the courtyard, Avelina picked up a metal needle and a scrap of cloak, and noticed dried dark stains. In the forest, she was met by Bertrand. the elderly husband of her former nurse. He gave her the men's clothing he had prepared and quickly led her away from the road before the guards appeared. On the way to the border, Evelina and Bertrand stopped for the night in a quiet valley. Near dawn, she was awakened by a familiar wordless melody, the way her mother used to hum. Evelina came out of their shelter and saw a boy with a small bow made of pale bone. "One arrow opens the heart," he said, while another, guided by someone else's hand, makes it close. He held out a small vial of clear salve. The boy explained that it would gradually draw the sleeping resin from wounds, but it had to be applied sparingly, while watching the patient's breathing and waiting patiently for the result. Without a healer's knowledge, the remedy might not help at all. By morning, the boy was gone. Only a white feather, resembling the fletching of an arrow, remained on the grass. Later, travelers said that Lucian was gravely ill. The court physicians could not stop the fever from returning. Remembering the needle she had found at the tower, Evelina understood who might need the salve, and decided to cross the border under the name of a traveling healer. Evelina and Bertrand reached Lucian's capital several days later. The palace's ceremonial gates were closed to ordinary visitors, and in the square, and near the apothecary's shop, people discussed the emperor's health. Evelina learned that the wounds had nearly healed, but a high fever returned every night. Lucian ate little, received no one, and spoke only with a few trusted people. Under her own name, Evelina could not expect to be granted a meeting. Lucian believed she had been involved in the trap, and might refuse even to listen. Besides, word of her appearance would quickly reach Leonora. First, the fever had to be stopped. Only then could she show him the letters and the evidence she had found. Evelina therefore decided to enter the palace in the guise of an unknown male healer. Evelina opened several stitches in the lining of her travelling dress and took out a gemstone hidden there. Bertrand had already found modest lodging for them, so she could spend the money it brought on something else. At a cloth merchant's shop, Evelina chose pale blue satin, and a tailor made it into a long man's doublet with a high collar and discreet silver clasps. She tucked her hair carefully beneath a dark cap. In front of the mirror, she practiced moving with greater restraint and speaking a little lower and more slowly, without altering her voice beyond recognition. The costly garment was meant to call to mind the physicians who were customarily received at noble courts. Meanwhile, Bertrand spread word through the city that an unknown physician in blue satin would accept no payment if he failed to ease the emperor's illness. It now became harder to turn him away without notice. The rumor reached the palace square, where the stranger soon became known as the healer in satin. While the tailor finished the doublet, Bertrand used an acquaintance among the palace servants to ask Martin for a secret meeting. Evelina came herself and immediately revealed her identity. Before the groom, she laid out Marta's reports, pages of handwriting practice, the forged seal, and the needle found near the tower. Then showed him the clear salve for the sleeping resin. Martin examined the papers for a long time. They explained the contradiction between Avelina's genuine letters and the strange invitation he had preserved after the trap. While Lucian is feverish, he may refuse my help, Avelina said. First, we must restore his clarity of mind. Martin appealed to the Lord Chamberlain. The court physicians objected, but agreed to a trial dressing under observation. Avelina set one condition. Only Martin would remain at the bedside. After a short dispute, the Chamberlain allowed the healer in satin one meeting. The healer in blue satin was led into Lucian's darkened room. The emperor was exhausted by fever, but could still hear the stranger clearly. The deliberately lowered, measured voice seemed strangely familiar, but the fever prevented him from holding on to the memory. As the healer had stipulated, the courtiers left, and only Martin remained beside the bed. Water splashed softly in a copper basin. The scent of sage mingled with the warmth of the muted fire, and linen strips rustled almost inaudibly in Avelina's hands. She removed the old bandages, washed the nearly healed needle marks, and applied a thin layer of the clear salve. Watching Lucian's breathing, the temperature of his skin, and his reaction, then she supported his wrist in her palm. "Bend your fingers slowly." Lucian obeyed and frowned. He felt as though he had seen that movement before. Even more familiar was the way the healer carefully smoothed the edge of the coverlet. Gradually, the fever eased a little, and his breathing grew steadier. For the first time in many nights, Lucian slept without delirium. Avelina remained beside him until his breathing had become completely peaceful, while Martin silently watched the first true sign of improvement. On the second and third days, the nightly fever returned with less force, although Lucian still tired quickly. The healer in blue satin came morning and evening, examining the needle marks, changing the bandages, listening to his breathing, and bringing him a light infusion. Before applying the salve, he warmed the vial between his palms for several moments. Then, as always, he supported Lucian's wrist and asked him to bend his fingers slowly. Once, the emperor's gaze lingered on the knot of a fresh bandage. It was exactly the same as the one he had seen on the wounded page's hand. The low voice was different, but some of its pauses reminded him of the conversation in the conservatory. Lucian decided that weakness was playing tricks on his memory and asked nothing. Between treatments, they spoke of the rain, the garden, and an old apple tree from his childhood. The healer did not flatter him, fill every silence, or treat him as though he were helpless. One evening, Lucian unexpectedly asked, "When will you come again?" By the fourth night, The fever had almost subsided, though Lucian still remained in bed. After changing the dressing, he began to speak of his own accord. He told of the letter that had arrived on the wrong day, the request to come early and unaccompanied, the brief laughter above the thicket, and the net that had dropped immediately afterward. Avelina listened in silence. Only her fingers paused for a moment on the folded bandage. For the first time, she now saw the events as Lucian had seen them. The letter had led him to the tower, the laughter had sounded just before the attack, and the onset of fever had left him no clarity in which to doubt. "I still love her," he said quietly. "Perhaps that is why it was easier for me to believe the worst than to admit that I understood nothing." It hurt Avelina to hear this. The contrived chain of events appeared convincing, but Lucian had still turned suspicion into a verdict. "Great pain sometimes makes us accept the first coherent explanation too soon," she said. Lucian was silent for a moment. "Perhaps that is exactly what I did." On the 5th day, after finishing the morning examination, the healer in Satin cautiously returned to Lucian's story. "Did you see Avelina near the mechanism?" Lucian frowned. "No, I heard her laughing from the window. But the letter was hers. Then why would she, after asking you to wait for witnesses, suddenly change her mind and choose another method of delivery?" The Emperor answered irritably that he remembered that night perfectly. But after a moment of silence, he himself repeated the events more slowly. The letter was written in familiar handwriting and stamped with a familiar seal. Laughter sounded from above. Then he stepped on the hidden mechanism. And could a prisoner in the upper room have set such a net beneath her own window? The healer asked. Lucian did not answer at once. He had indeed seen the letter, heard the laughter, and walked into a trap. But he had not seen who wrote the letter, whether Avelina knew of the net, or why she had laughed. He summoned Martin. "Bring me that letter and the cloak I wore that night." On the 6th day, Martin brought Lucian's cloak and the preserved invitation. While examining the lining, they found a fragment of a thin metal needle. Its thickened base bore the tiny maker's mark of an armourer whose wares were used by Leonora's personal guard. Then the healer in Satin held the letter up to the light. "There is a watermark here," he said. An iris appeared in the paper. Martin confirmed that such sheets were commissioned for the elder princess's private chancery. For comparison, he took out Avelina's genuine letters, received by way of the silk cord. They had been written on plain slips of paper, torn from her small notebook. This did not yet prove who had ordered the net installed or the forgery made. But now both the letter and the mechanism led to people in Leonora's circle. Lucian remained silent for a long time, turning the two letters over in his hands again and again. "And I decided I already knew the truth," he said at last. "And after I returned, I did not even try to obtain an answer from Avelina. I believed the worst before I verified it." By the 7th night, the fever no longer returned, though Lucian was still weak. Leaning on the healer in Satin's arm, he walked to the window and gazed at the dark garden for a long time. "I will find Avelina," he said, "not to demand an answer. I want to listen to her and ask her forgiveness. If she does not wish to return to me or renew our engagement, I will accept it." The healer did not answer at once. In the morning, Lucian woke and saw the blue doublet neatly folded on an armchair. A woman in simple, pale clothing stood by the window. First, he noticed the familiar hands. Then he heard her true voice. "Now I can tell you everything myself." Lucian raised his eyes and finally recognized Avelina. She placed Marta's reports, the pages of handwriting practice, and the forged seal before him, briefly explaining her escape and disguise. Lucian listened in silence, without interrupting or averting his gaze. Only now did he understand. For 7 days, the woman whose explanation he had once refused to hear had treated him and listened to him. Lucian heard Avelina to the end and said simply, "I ask your forgiveness. I believed the accusation before I tried to hear you." Avelina did not answer at once. "I came to heal you neither for gratitude nor to restore our engagement. I still love you, Lucian, but that is not enough for trust to return at once." She said that she needed time, not for tests, but to learn whether in the future he would speak of his doubts before turning them into accusations, and listen to another person to the end before passing judgment. "I understand," Lucian replied, and asked for nothing more. They then decided to return to Oba together and present the collected evidence before neutral representatives, not as betrothed lovers, but as 2 witnesses to the same crime. Lucian ordered his troops to remain beyond the border. The neutral ambassadors arrived that evening. Martin and Bertrand would travel with Avelina and Lucian. Avelina and Lucian arrived without an army, accompanied by a small retinue and the neutral ambassadors. In the throne room, Avelina laid out Marta's reports, the handwriting samples, the forged seal, the false invitation, the watermarked sheet, and the broken needle. Oba spoke first. He admitted that he had permitted his daughter to be taken away, given Leonora the royal seal, and agreed to call her disappearance a voluntary refusal. He had feared a political conflict, had grown too accustomed to entrusting difficult decisions to his elder daughter, and had evaded responsibility himself. Leonora confirmed the imprisonment, but denied any connection to the trap. Martin then told of the letter, the net, and the needle found in the cloak. With her eyes lowered, Marta admitted that, on Leonora's orders, she had provided samples of Avelina's handwriting and an impression of the old seal, and had allowed the armourers access to the tower. After that, Leonora stopped arguing. "I did not want him to die. I wanted him to turn away from Avelina forever." She said that since childhood, She had been accustomed to earning love through usefulness, and had taken Lucian's choice as proof that she was not needed. Avelina heard her sister to the end. She now understood where the path had begun, but knowing the cause could not undo what had been done. After the confessions, Oba abdicated the throne, acknowledging that he no longer had the right to shift decisions onto his daughters. A council assumed rule for a transitional year. Leonora renounced her right of succession for 7 years, and under the council's supervision, went to the borderlands to restore roads, wells, infirmaries, and settlements whose needs she had once used to justify her decisions. Avelina took part in the council's work, but was in no hurry to accept the crown. Lucian did not rush her into marriage either. For a year they corresponded, met at the openings of infirmaries, and learned to speak of fears and doubts before they turned into accusations. When the council had defined the limits of power and the order of governance, Avelina accepted responsibility for her kingdom. Then, of her own free will, she also agreed to become Lucian's wife. Their wedding took place in the infirmary courtyard without undue splendor. The two nations kept their laws, councils, and borders, entering into an alliance of equals. And the blue doublet remained in the physician's room beside Avelina's notebook and clean linen bandages, a remembrance of the days, after which they learned to ask first and decide only afterward.